Money waits for its orders. Give them tonight. Florence Scovel Shinn. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the very supply you have been begging for has been standing at the door of your life for years, patient as a servant, waiting only for you to open your mouth and command it in. In the book of Job, the 22nd chapter, the 28th verse, it is written, "Thou shalt decree a thing, and it shall be established unto thee, and the light shall shine upon thy ways." And Florence Scovel Shinn would stop you right there and say, "Do you see it? The word is decree, not beg, not hope, not wish, decree, which is the language of a sovereign giving an order to a servant who has never once disobeyed. And here is the part that stops most people cold. Money is not withholding itself from you out of judgment. Money is simply standing at attention, waiting for its orders, and you have been so busy pleading with it that you never noticed it was saluting you the whole time, waiting on your word. This very night, that word can be spoken, and if you have spent years assuming your lack was a punishment or a mystery, you are not the only one. So many good-hearted people have knelt at the window of their own life, asking permission for what was theirs to command all along. Say it with me. Money is my faithful servant. It has been waiting all along for my spoken word. I give my orders now in perfect faith. My word is my wand. Again, money is my faithful servant. It has been waiting all along for my spoken word. I give my orders now in perfect faith. My word is my wand. And if something in you just went quiet, just now, like a door you forgot existed has quietly opened, type the 2 words, orders given, down in the comments, right now, before the feeling passes. Let it be your seal on everything you are about to hear. The first key is this. You have spent years standing at the window of your own life like a servant, hoping someone else will hand you your fortune. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this posture alone is what keeps supply locked outside the door. Because the universe is not a stingy employer weighing whether you deserve your wages. It is a vast and faithful storehouse, waiting for the word of command from the one being it was built to obey. And that being is you. Picture the woman who checks her mailbox every single day, hoping a check will simply appear. She rehearses the same walk every afternoon, down the drive, fingers already tightening before the little door even swings open. And when it is empty again, she sighs and tells herself that is just how things go for someone like her. She is not commanding anything. She is pleading, and pleading is a posture of lack. It tells the unseen substance, I am small, I am at the mercy of circumstance. Notice, she never once considered speaking to her circumstances directly. She only ever watched them, the way a servant watches a closed door, instead of simply opening it. But the moment she turns from that mailbox and says quietly and with authority, my needs are met now, and money comes to me freely and in full, she has stopped begging and started ordering. It is not luck that changes a life. It is language, and it is worth sitting with that plainly for a moment, because most people spend their whole lives waiting for luck to notice them, when the real shift was always available in their own mouths. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that money is one of the most obedient forces in creation. It has never once denied a clear and faith-filled order. It has only ever been confused by a mind that orders one thing with its mouth and cancels it with worry 5 minutes later. Think of how strange that would look in an ordinary household. A woman telling her servant to prepare the guest room, then rushing back 10 minutes later to say, never mind, no one is really coming. The servant would stand there bewildered, unsure which order to actually follow, and that bewilderment, multiplied 1,000 times over, is exactly the static most people broadcast toward their own supply every single day without realizing it. So tonight, before you sleep, notice where in your life you have been waiting at a window instead of speaking from a throne. Notice the small daily checking, the hoping, the sighing when nothing appears. That noticing alone begins to turn the key, because you cannot correct a posture you refuse to see. But noticing is only the beginning, since a scepter resting unused on a cushion changes nothing until a hand actually lifts it and speaks. It does not glow on its own. It does not command on its own. It simply waits, patient as everything else in this teaching has been patient. For you, I am not a beggar at the gate. I am the one who commands it open. The second key is this. Your spoken word functions exactly like a check written against an account that can never be overdrawn. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the substance behind all visible supply is limitless. It is only your own words and beliefs that determine how much of it you actually draw out. Think of a woman standing at a bank counter. She does not fill out a withdrawal slip and then apologize to the teller. She does not whisper it. She does not hedge it with maybe, or if it's meant to be. She writes the amount clearly, signs her name with confidence, and slides it across the counter, knowing the funds are already hers. That is exactly what happens every time you speak a sentence about your life. Only the counter is the unseen substance itself, and the ink is your conviction. So when you say, business is terrible right now, you have just written a check against lack and signed it with your own name, and it clears every time. Because the universe does not audit your words for whether you meant them, it simply honors them as your official order. This is why Florence Scovel Shinn was so insistent that idle complaining is never idle. There is no idle word where supply is concerned. Every sentence is a signature. Consider the man who says, "I never get a break," and says it so often it becomes his signature line at dinner parties. He has been writing that same check for 20 years, and the bank, being perfectly faithful, has been honoring it for 20 years. Now consider what happens the week he simply stops signing that check. He catches the sentence in his throat. He replaces it with, "I am open now to a fortunate turn." At first it feels foreign, like signing your name with the wrong hand. But the account does not care how the signature feels. It only cares that it was written. Now walk with me into an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. A woman named Alice stands in line at the grocery store, watching the total climb on the little screen above the register, and under her breath she murmurs, "This is going to wipe me out." She is not shouting it. She is not even fully aware she said it, but the unseen substance is not deaf to whispers. It is only listening for signatures. And that small murmur was a signature, clean and legible. A moment later she reaches her car, and out of habit more than belief, she adds, "Well, at least the lights are still on," as though patting herself on the back for surviving rather than thriving. And this too becomes an entry, small, almost invisible, and yet Florence Scovel Shinn would tell her plainly that there is no such thing as a whisper too quiet for the ledger to hear. The account keeps perfect records, regardless of tone, regardless of volume. It does not distinguish between a check written boldly at a podium and a check written quietly in a parking lot. Both are honored exactly alike. Now picture a different kind of ledger, the small paper kind, a careful woman used to keep tucked in her purse. Every entry written in her own hand. And imagine that ledger is really your life. Every stray remark you make about being broke, about missing out, about never catching a fortunate break, is an entry written neatly into that book. In ink, not pencil. Because the unseen substance does not deal in erasers, it deals only in what was actually recorded. This is why Florence Scovel Shinn taught that a person can pray beautifully for 10 minutes in the morning and then spend the rest of the day quietly overdrawing the very account she just funded. A single sentence muttered in traffic. A single complaint sighed to a co-worker over lunch. Each one is a separate entry, and the ledger simply totals whatever was written. It does not weigh which entry you meant more sincerely. And this is precisely where Alice from the grocery store finds herself by supper time, having spoken one grand, hopeful line into her mirror that morning, and a dozen small, worried lines into her ordinary afternoon, wondering later why the grand line never seems to be the one that clears. It is not the size of the check that matters most. It is the steadiness of the hand that writes it. A small sum, written with calm certainty, clears faster and cleaner than a large sum written with a trembling, apologetic hand. And it is worth noticing that the opposite is equally true. A small, worried complaint muttered without thought clears just as fast as a grand declaration spoken with trembling hope. The account is faithful, not selective. It simply cashes whatever crosses the counter. So tonight, before you speak about money at all, picture yourself actually holding the pen, feel the weight of it, and ask silently, what am I about to sign my name to? Because whatever you say next, the account is already reaching for its stamp, ready to honor it, faithfully, exactly as written, with no hesitation, and no appeal. My spoken word is a check drawn on a supply that never runs dry. The third key is this: faith is the ticket that gets your order to the kitchen. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that an order spoken without faith is like a waiter who writes the ticket and then quietly slips it into his own pocket, instead of clipping it to the spike where the cooks can see it. Nothing happens. Not because the kitchen is unwilling, but because the order never actually reached the one who could fill it. Picture a busy dinner service. Orders flying in from every table. The cooks do not ask whether the guest deserves the meal. They do not question whether the kitchen can afford the ingredients. They simply read the ticket and begin. That is how the unseen substance works with your spoken word. It does not interrogate you. It only responds to what is clearly placed before it. Faith is what places it there. Doubt is what keeps it folded in your own pocket. This is why so many people speak beautiful affirmations in the morning and undo them by lunch. They write the ticket, then they walk back to the kitchen 20 minutes later and quietly take it down because the bill has not arrived yet and their nerve failed. Let me give you a small everyday picture of exactly how this looks. A man decides, on a Monday morning, that he will speak a new order over his finances. He says it quietly in his car before work. Opportunity is already on its way to me, and for a moment he feels the lift of it. But by Wednesday, when nothing visible has changed, he starts checking his phone every hour, as though watching the kitchen door. By Thursday, he is telling a coworker, "Well, we'll see. I'm not holding my breath." And without realizing it, he has walked back to the kitchen and quietly pulled his own ticket off the spike. The cooks never got the chance to finish the order because he took it back himself before it could be filled. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this is the single most common way good is lost. Not through a lack of belief at the moment of speaking, but through a slow, anxious retrieval in the days that follow. Faith, she taught, is not a feeling you must maintain at a fever pitch every hour. It is simply the discipline of leaving the ticket where you put it, of not walking back to check on something you have already, in good conscience, handed over. Consider the difference between a woman anxiously craning her neck toward the kitchen door every 10 seconds and a woman who has placed her order, folded her napkin in her lap, and returned calmly to the conversation. Both of them are waiting for the exact same meal, the same order, the same kitchen, but only one of them is actually going to enjoy the wait. And enjoying the wait, strange as it sounds, is itself part of what allows the order through, because a settled woman is not sending a second, contradictory message every few minutes. She gave her order once, clearly, and she is behaving as though it is already being prepared. This is why Florence Scovel Shinn placed such quiet weight on the state of mind a person keeps between the speaking and the receiving. That gap, that waiting room, is where most orders are lost or won, not at the moment of the decree itself. And so tonight, if you have already spoken your word over some area of your life, the work now is simply to leave it clipped to the spike, to stop walking back into the kitchen to check on it, to fold your napkin, so to speak, and return to your evening. I place my order in faith, and I leave the kitchen to its work. The fourth key is this, and it is the one that quietly decides every other key. The order you give is only ever as strong as the self you believe you are while you give it. Florence Scovel Shinn taught endlessly about this thing she called the self-concept, the private picture a person carries of who they are, what they deserve, and what is possible for someone like them, and she taught that no spoken word can rise higher than the self-concept standing behind it. You can decree all day long that money comes to you freely and in full, but if underneath those words there lives a quiet, tired conviction that says people like me don't get breaks like that, the deeper picture will always win. Because the deeper picture is the one actually giving the orders, the words are only its messenger. Picture your own face in the mirror some ordinary morning, half asleep, reaching for the toothbrush without even looking, and notice, gently, which face looks back at you. Is it a tired face, bracing itself for another hard day? Or is it, even faintly, a settled face, a face that already knows it is provided for? Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this is not vanity, it is diagnosis, because the mirror does not lie about your self-concept, even when your words do. Let me walk you through an ordinary day so you can see exactly how this operates, because it is easier to see in the small hours than in the big declarations. A woman wakes at 7, and her first thought, before she has even opened her eyes, is "Here we go again." That is an order, spoken silently, but received clearly. At 7:15, she looks at her bank balance and sighs, and that sigh is an order too, a wordless one. But the unseen substance does not require words. It reads the state you are broadcasting. At 8, she tells a friend on the phone, "Things have just been so tight lately." Another order, signed and dated. At noon, she passes a beautiful home on her lunch walk and thinks, "That's not for someone like me." And there it is again, the self-concept, quietly overriding every affirmation she recited that morning in the bathroom mirror. At 3 in the afternoon, a small unexpected bill arrives and she says, "Of course, just my luck," sealing the day's orders with her own signature. By evening, nothing about her outer circumstances has technically changed, but she has spent an entire day decreeing lack in 100 small, unnoticed ways, while spending perhaps 90 seconds that morning decreeing abundance in front of the mirror, and she wonders, sincerely, why the 90 seconds didn't work. Florence Scovel Shinn would say gently, "My dear, it is not that your word failed you, it is that your word was outvoted by 99 other silent orders spoken all day long from an old, tired self-concept that never got the memo that the 90 seconds were supposed to change anything." Now consider a second woman, living a very similar outward life, similar balance, similar bills, similar small, unexpected expense, arriving that very same afternoon. But she carries a different picture of herself underneath. When the bill arrives, she says, without any performance, "Oh, that's fine, it's already handled," and moves on. Not because she has more money sitting in the account, she may have less, but because her self-concept has already quietly decided that she is the kind of woman for whom things work out. That single difference, invisible to anyone watching, changes everything about which orders are actually reaching the unseen substance all day long. And here is a second angle on this same key, worth sitting with quietly for a moment. Because self-concept is rarely built alone, it is very often inherited. Picture a young man sitting at his family's dinner table as a boy, hearing his father say, again and again over the years, "We're not the kind of people who get ahead," said lightly, almost as a joke, passed around the table the way bread is passed. No one at that table meant any harm by it, and yet that sentence was quietly filed away in the boy's private picture of himself, long before he was old enough to question it. Decades later, sitting in an interview for a position he is genuinely qualified for, he feels a small, familiar tightening in his chest just before he speaks. An old, borrowed conviction rising up uninvited, and he undersells himself, gently, almost politely, Without ever knowing why, Florence Scovel Shinn taught that a self-concept absorbed this early does not announce itself as a belief at all. It disguises itself as simply being realistic, being humble, knowing your place. And this is precisely why it goes unexamined for so long. No one questions a belief that has learned to sound like common sense. It is not enough, then, to change your words. You must change the self who is speaking them. It is not the affirmation that fails. It is the identity behind it that has not yet been told the news. Pause for a moment now and pick one real area of your life. Just one. Money, a relationship, your health, and ask yourself honestly, what does the person living inside me right now actually believe about what they deserve in this area? Not what you wish you believed, what you actually believe when no one is listening. Notice the tone you use with yourself in that private moment. Is it patient, or is it the tone of someone scolding a child who never learns? Be honest, because the unseen substance already knows the answer, and it has been faithfully filling that exact order every day of your life, whether you noticed or not. Once you see the self-concept clearly, you can begin the true work, which is not scrubbing at your circumstances, but quietly building a new inner picture, a woman who carries herself, in her private thoughts, the way a well-provided-for woman carries herself. Not proud, not boastful, simply settled, the way you feel settled, walking through a house you already own. That settledness is worth more than 100 perfect affirmations recited by someone who still secretly feels like a guest in her own life. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the imagination is the workshop where this new self-concept is built, and that you visit that workshop not with effort, but with quiet, repeated, almost playful attention. Think of the imagination less as a machine you must force into motion, and more as a quiet room you are simply allowed to sit in, again and again, until it starts to feel like home, rather than a place you are only visiting. 4 small practices carry most of this work. First, catching the tired face in the mirror and, without forcing a smile, simply speaking one settled sentence to it, quietly, the way you would reassure a nervous friend. Second, noticing the small sentences you use about yourself to others. I'm just someone who always struggles with money, and replacing them, not with grand declarations, but with plainer, steadier language. I'm someone who is learning to receive easily. Third, rehearsing, in a few quiet minutes before sleep, small ordinary scenes lived by the woman you are becoming. Opening an envelope without flinching, greeting an unexpected expense with the same calm as the second woman in our story, walking through your own home the way you would walk through a house you already fully own. And fourth, catching the inherited sentence when it surfaces, the borrowed conviction handed to you at some family table years ago, and quietly setting it down the moment you recognize it was never even yours to begin with. This is the deep work behind every order you will ever give, and it changes the ordinary day we just walked through completely. Because a woman who wakes with a settled self-concept does not sigh at her balance, does not need to sigh, because the sighing was never really about the number, it was about who she believed herself to be while looking at the number. Change the believer, and every single order that day, spoken and silent, begins to align on its own, without strain, without 100 corrections. It is not the number in the account that must change first. It is the crowned face in the mirror that must be recognized first. And the number, patiently, learns to follow. This is the 4th key, and it is the quiet hinge on which the whole door of this teaching swings. I am the well-provided-for woman I have quietly decided to become. The 5th key is this. Doubt does not merely weaken an order, it cancels it, fully, the way a stop payment cancels a check, no matter how beautifully it was written. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that a single anxious relapse can undo an entire day of faithful decreeing, not because the universe is petty, but because the anxious thought is itself a new order, a later one, and later orders overwrite earlier ones. Picture a man who speaks a clear, calm decree in the morning. Supply flows to me easily today, and carries it sincerely for hours, but by 3 in the afternoon, waiting on a delayed reply, he mutters under his breath, "It's never going to come through." That single mutter is a stop payment slip, walked directly to the counter, and he does not even remember saying it an hour later. Yet the order has already been quietly cancelled behind the scenes. This is why Florence Scovel Shinn was so firm about watching the small offhand remarks far more closely than the grand declarations. Because the grand declaration is spoken once with intention, but the small doubtful remark slips out a dozen times a day, completely unguarded, wearing the disguise of harmless venting, of just being realistic. She taught, there is no such thing as a harmless doubtful word where supply is concerned. Every one of them is received in full. Consider a woman waiting on a house to sell. She speaks her morning decree beautifully. This house sells now for the right price to the right buyer. But then a friend calls and asks how the sale is going, and she says, "Oh, you know how the market is, probably going to sit for months." She has just spoken an entirely new order, calmly, almost cheerfully, without noticing she did it at all. Doubt rarely arrives dressed as fear. It arrives dressed as realism, as simply describing the facts. But a fact once spoken becomes a fresh command. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the moment doubt rises, you do not need to fight it or shame yourself. You simply speak over it immediately, the way you would correct a typo before it is mailed, rather than after. Catching it in the same breath costs you nothing. Catching it a week later costs you the entire order. So when that woman notices what she said, the correction is simple, quietly, even just to herself. "I take that back. This house sells now." And the correction, spoken with the same calm authority as the original decree, is honored just as fully as the doubt was. This is why the wise ones she wrote about kept a gentle vigilance over their own words all day long. Not anxious policing of every syllable, but the calm watchfulness of a woman guarding a small flame from drafts, glancing now and then to make sure it still burns, gently cupping her hand around it whenever a stray breeze passes through. I cancel every doubtful word the instant I hear myself say it. The 6th key is this, and it concerns a kind of death, though not the kind that frightens anyone. And let us be clear about that word before we go any further, because Florence Scovel Shinn was never speaking of the ending of a person. She was speaking of the ending of a costume, the false self that pretended to be you for so many years that you began answering to its name. The real self was never in danger. The real self was only waiting, quietly, for the costume to be set down, so that it could finally be seen. She taught that before the new supply can enter fully, the old identity that lived comfortably inside lack must be allowed to dissolve. Not fought, not shamed, simply allowed to dissolve, the way frost dissolves once the sun has been out long enough. And it helps to say this plainly. It is not death that is being asked of you. It is undressing, the small daily undressing of a self that was only ever a garment, never your skin. Picture a woman who has spent 15 years introducing herself, even silently in her own mind, as someone who has to be careful with money. She says it so often that it becomes less like a sentence and more like a name tag pinned to her chest. "Hello, my name is Careful. Hello, my name is Not Enough." And she wears that name tag into every store, every conversation about a raise, every glance at a menu where she quietly does the math before she orders. One evening, cleaning out a hallway closet, she finds an old winter coat she has not worn in years, faded at the cuffs, too heavy for the mild winters her city has now. And it strikes her, gently, that she has been wearing an identical coat every single day without ever noticing, an old, heavy, out-of-season conviction about who she is and what she can afford, kept not because it still fits her actual life, but purely out of habit, because taking it off would mean walking outside feeling, for a moment, unfamiliar to herself. This is the strange mechanism Florence Scovel Shinn described. The old self is rarely destroyed by a dramatic event. It is simply set down, quietly, almost by accident. Notice that the woman in this story did nothing to earn a new supply that evening. She made no new decree. She simply recognized a costume for what it was, and recognition alone loosened its grip. At first, without the coat, she feels almost exposed, a little cold, because the coat had become part of how she recognized herself in the mirror each morning. This is normal. This is even a good sign. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the discomfort of shedding an old identity is not evidence that something has gone wrong. It is evidence that something true is finally being allowed room to breathe. Underneath the coat, the whole time, there was someone lighter, someone who was never actually poor, only dressed as poor. Let us slow down and look at this from more than one angle. First, consider that the coat is not only worn, it is also mended, over and over. Every time a small piece of evidence threatens to slip through and show the truth underneath, a woman receives an unexpected compliment on her work, and instead of simply saying thank you, she quickly patches the moment with, "Oh, it was nothing. Anyone could have done it." That patch keeps the old coat wearable one more season. A man is offered a small, unearned kindness, someone quietly covering his coffee, and instead of receiving it easily, he insists on paying it back within the hour, as though owing nothing to anyone were the true measure of his worth. So many people believe they are waiting for new supply, when really they are busy, without noticing, mending the very garment that keeps them from feeling it when it arrives. Second, consider that new supply often arrives in small, quiet ways, long before the coat comes off, but it cannot be recognized while the old costume still hangs so heavily on the shoulders. A compliment lands and gets waved away as an accident. A small opportunity appears and gets dismissed as a fluke instead of noticed as a pattern beginning to form. Consider a shopkeeper who built, in genuine hardship, a tight-fisted, anxious relationship with every coin that passed through his register. Decades later, his shop is thriving. The shelves are full, but he still counts the till twice a night, with the same tight jaw he had 30 years ago. The shop grew, the coat never came off, and so he still walks through abundance dressed for famine. This is what Florence Scovel Shinn meant when she spoke of an old identity clinging on long after its season has ended. It is not stubbornness, it is habit, worn so long it feels like skin instead of fabric. But it can always be set down, the moment you allow yourself to actually notice you are wearing it. Third, consider how ordinary the actual moment of release tends to look. No mountaintop, no thunderclap. It is simply one ordinary morning where you catch yourself reaching for the old, careful sentence, and instead of finishing it out of habit, you let it fall quiet in your mouth, unfinished, and you walk out the door a little lighter, unsure at first what to do with your hands now that they are not gripping anything. And that unfamiliar lightness is exactly where the true self has been waiting for you all along. And there is a fourth thing worth naming gently, which is that the coat rarely comes off all at once. It comes off one sleeve at a time. A woman may set down the old belief about money on a Tuesday and still be quietly wearing the old belief about love, or about her own body, or about what kind of welcome she deserves in a room full of strangers. This is not failure. This is simply how undressing actually happens in a real life. Florence Scovel Shinn never taught that the old self dissolves in a single afternoon. She taught that it dissolves the way frost dissolves, patch by patch, in the places the sun reaches first. And you are not behind, simply because one sleeve is still heavy, while the other has already fallen free. The old, careful coat falls away, and the true self underneath was never poor. The seventh key is this, and it is the deepest one. So let us take it in 5 pieces, slowly, the way you would walk carefully down old stone stairs, feeling for each one before you trust your weight to it. First, Consider that most people's orders never fail because the wording was weak. They fail because the pipe carrying them is clogged. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught, again and again, that the clog is almost always resentment, an old grudge held against a parent, a former partner, a sibling who got the larger share. These are not merely tender memories. She taught they are physical obstructions sitting inside the very channel through which your good must travel to reach you. Picture a plumber called to a house where every faucet runs thin. The homeowner insists the water company must be at fault. But the plumber does not look upstream. He looks downstream, into the walls of that house, and finds, lodged in an old bend of pipe, years of build-up, nothing wrong with the supply at all, only an obstruction close to home. This is exactly the picture of the person who prays beautifully, decrees boldly, and still finds the flow thin. The substance was never rationed, the channel was simply blocked, and she was insistent, "You cannot skip this plumbing work by praying harder. You can recite the loveliest decree in the world, and it will still back up against whatever old fist of grievance sits in the bend." This is why she taught forgiveness, not as a soft moral nicety performed for the other person's benefit, but as urgent, unglamorous plumbing work performed entirely for your own account. Holding a grudge against your brother costs you money. This sounds almost scandalous, but she said it plainly, because supply and resentment cannot occupy the same channel at the same time. A grudge behaves like scale inside an old pipe. It thickens quietly every time the memory is replayed, every time the old scene is reenacted with fresh outrage, until a thin residue becomes a wall thick enough to stop the flow. And the frightening part is how ordinary this feels from the inside. No one wakes and announces, "I have decided to block my own supply today." They simply think, for the 1,000th time, about what he did to me, and call it justice, never noticing the plumber's tools sitting unused in the closet the whole time. Second, consider what forgiveness actually is, because it is so often mistaken for approval, saying what happened was acceptable. It is not that at all. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that forgiveness is simply the willingness to release someone from the courtroom you have been quietly running in your own mind, sometimes for years, the endless replaying of what they did, the imagined confrontations rehearsed in the shower, the speeches composed in the car and never delivered, all of it expensive, far more expensive than most people calculate, because it costs enormous inner energy that could have gone toward building the very good you are trying to decree. And worse, it keeps your attention locked onto lack, onto being owed something, which is itself a subtle form of begging, only now aimed at a person instead of the true and unseen source. Picture a woman who spends every Sunday afternoon composing, in her head, the perfect letter to a former business partner who cheated her years ago. She never sends it, she simply refines it, week after week, not noticing that every one of those afternoons was spent decreeing the past instead of the future, standing in an old courtroom instead of at the counter of her own supply, and this courtroom rarely announces itself with dramatic tears. It hums quietly in the background of an otherwise ordinary life, present while she folds laundry, present for no reason at all except some small unrelated thing reminded her of him, and each time it convenes again, a little more good is quietly turned away at the door, because her hands were full of old evidence, instead of open to receive. Pause for a moment now, and let one real name surface. Just one. Someone you may have been quietly keeping on trial. You do not need to decide today that what they did was fine. You only need to notice that the trial itself has been costing you, and set a small, private intention to close the courtroom, even for tonight, even for the length of one long breath. Notice what loosens in your chest the moment you do. That loosening is not sentiment. It is plumbing. It is the bend in the pipe, beginning to clear. Third, consider the ordinary day again, the woman and her small sighs scattered across the morning. Now imagine underneath all those small daily lacking orders sat one old resentment, unnamed, toward a mother who once said, offhand, at the kitchen table, that she would never be good with money. That single unhealed sentence can quietly clog the pipe for an entire lifetime. Every fresh decree that daughter speaks as a grown woman has to squeeze past that old blockage first. No wonder the results feel thin. No wonder the good arrives late, or small, or tangled. She raises her own affirmations each morning, sincere, well-worded, and still the money trickles rather than flows, and she assumes the fault lies in her wording, when the true work was never there at all. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that healing that one old wound could do more for this woman's supply in a single evening than 5 years of disciplined affirmations spoken over a channel that was never clear. This is not about excusing the mother, it is about freeing the daughter, reclaiming her own pipeline, her own right to receive without an old fist sitting in the bend of it. And once she does this quiet work, often without ever telling her mother, she notices opportunities that used to feel like flukes, now feel like patterns. A raise that arrives unasked, a client who pays early instead of late. None of these are new laws suddenly switching on. They are simply the old law finally running through a clear pipe, and it is worth noticing how patient that old sentence was, waiting decades in the dark bend for someone to finally reach in and remove it, never weakening on its own, because time alone does not dissolve a grievance, only a decision does, and there is a fourth piece hiding quietly inside the other three, gentler and easy to miss, which is this. Sometimes the person you have not forgiven is yourself, the version of you who made the bad investment, who trusted the wrong partner, who stayed 3 years too long in the wrong job. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that self-condemnation is one of the heaviest clogs of all, heavier even than resentment held toward others, because it sits nearest the very mouth of the pipe. Picture a man who lost a modest inheritance in a hasty decision 15 years ago. He has since rebuilt steadily, and yet at 2 a.m, some nights he still hears his own voice calling himself careless, using language toward himself he would never use toward a friend with the same story. That voice, repeated quietly for 15 years, is a fist placed in his own pipeline by his own hand, and no amount of daytime decreeing fully clears a channel clogged again every night at 2 a.m. Releasing himself is not pretending the decision was wise, it is simply recognizing the obstruction has done its work of teaching him what it came to teach, and it is time to remove it so the good waiting behind it can finally move. This self-forgiveness feels, mistakenly, like it might invite carelessness again. But Florence Scovel Shinn taught the opposite. A person who has truly forgiven their own past mistake makes wiser decisions afterward, because they are no longer spending half their energy defending an old wound. Notice, too, that this same man, on mornings after undisturbed sleep, speaks more generously to his staff, quotes a fairer price without squeezing every coin from a customer out of some old private fear. Self-forgiveness does not only clear the account, it softens the whole day. A clear pipe carries the person differently, gentler in traffic, more patient with a slow waiter, all of it simply the water running clean. And there is a fifth and final piece, quieter than all the others, which is that sometimes the resentment is aimed at no single person at all, but at life itself, at the unseen source, for having been slow, for having let the hard years happen the way they happened, a private, unspoken grievance held against the very substance you are now petitioning. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught this hidden resentment may be the most costly of all, because it clogs the pipe at its very source. Picture a woman who never says an unkind word about any particular person, gracious to her mother, gracious to her former partner, gracious even to herself, and yet carries, deep beneath it all, a quiet, weary suspicion that life has simply never been fair to her, that good things happen easily for others, and slowly, if at all, for her. This suspicion rarely announces itself as resentment. It disguises itself as realism, but it is resentment all the same, aimed upward, At the very source, she is asking to fill her order. And the remedy is the same as all the rest. Not argument, not forced cheerfulness, simply a quiet releasing, a willingness to stop keeping the ledger of old unfairness and let the account run clear. And once that channel opens, all of it, the resentment released outward, the resentment released inward, and the quiet grievance released upward, the earlier keys we have already walked through finally have clear passage. The decree spoken with authority, the check written in confidence, the order placed in faith and left with the kitchen, the settled self-concept quietly built. All of it had been true and correctly done, and still thin, still slow, still tangled, simply because the channel carrying it home was not yet clear. This is why the seventh key comes here, not because it is more mystical than the others, but because it is more foundational than any of them. It is the plumbing beneath the house, invisible, unglamorous, and utterly decisive comes. I release every old grievance, including the one I hold against myself, and my channel runs clear. The eighth key is this. Once the order is given, and the channel is clear, the work that remains is simply to keep the flame steady. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that most orders are not lost through disbelief on the first day. They are lost through fatigue, somewhere around the 7th or the 14th day. When the check has not yet arrived, and the temptation rises to quietly take the order back, it is not the giving of the order that proves your faith. It is the tending of it afterward, through the ordinary, uneventful hours when nothing seems to be happening at all. Think of a lighthouse keeper during a long storm. The ships out at sea do not need him to feel cheerful. They do not need him to be certain the storm will end by morning. They only need the light to stay lit, steadily, hour after hour, whether he feels like tending it or not. That is exactly the posture Florence Scovel Shinn describes, for the person waiting on a spoken word to manifest. Consider a woman who has spoken her order clearly, a new position, better suited to her, coming to her easily and in perfect time. She speaks it Monday morning with real conviction. By Wednesday, nothing has moved, and this is precisely where most people quietly extinguish their own light. She checks her phone 40 times before noon. She refreshes her email the way a starving woman checks an empty cupboard, hoping something appeared since the last look. By Thursday, she is telling her sister, "Well, nothing's come of it yet, probably won't." And without realizing it, she has walked to the top of her own lighthouse and blown out the very flame she lit 3 days before. Florence Scovel Shinn would say gently, "My dear, the ships were still out there. You simply stopped holding the light for them. It is not the lighting of the flame that saves the ships. It is the keeping of it lit long after the excitement of striking the match has worn off." And this is worth looking at from a second angle, because there is a difference between patience and resignation that most people never learn to tell apart. Resignation says, "I suppose it isn't coming," and folds its hands in defeat. Patience says, "It is coming," and simply continues setting the table. Resignation feels like giving up quietly. Patience feels like standing guard quietly. And from the outside, in the first few days, they can look almost identical. Both women are sitting still. Both are saying little. But one has let the flame go dark inside her, while the other is holding it steady behind a calm face. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this inner distinction is everything, because the unseen substance responds not to your outward composure, but to what is actually burning, or not burning, behind it. So what does keeping the flame actually look like across an ordinary week? It looks like this. When 3 days pass with no visible movement, you do not announce to your household that it isn't working. You do not revise your order downward just to feel safer. You keep the drawer tidy for the money that is coming. You keep the calendar open for the opportunity that is coming. You keep your speech clean of the old lacking sentences, even when the waiting feels long, and even when a small voice insists that this time might be the exception. And there is also a gentle discipline here around other people's doubt, because someone will inevitably ask you, in a concerned tone, "How is that job situation going?" Or "How is that money you were expecting?" And the old habit is to sigh and hand them the discouraging update, trading your light for their comfort in the conversation. But the eighth key asks you to keep the flame steady, even in that moment, a brief, calm, "It's working itself out," said with the same settled tone a lighthouse keeper uses when a passing sailor calls up through the wind, asking if the light will hold till dawn. "Of course it will," he answers, not because he can see the dawn from where he stands, but because tending the flame is simply what he does regardless of what the night looks like. Notice, too, that the keeper does not relight the flame every hour, as though it went out. He does not stand there striking match after match in a panic, each time a gust of wind rattles the glass. He tends one steady flame continuously. And this is the quiet difference between a person who affirms once with feeling and then spends the following days anxiously reaffirming out of fear, and a person who affirms once with feeling and then simply lives. Unremarkably, as though it were already settled, the first woman exhausts herself relighting a flame that never actually went out, mistaking her own nervousness for necessary maintenance. The second woman's flame never needs relighting because she never let it gutter in the first place. And there is real relief available the moment you see this, because it means the work asked of you here is not more effort, it is less struggle, less checking, less rehearsing the worst case in the shower, and more simply letting the light burn on its own while you return your attention to your ordinary evening. Pause for a moment now, and notice honestly whether some order you spoke days or weeks ago has quietly gone dim inside you. Notice whether you have begun rehearsing disappointment just to protect yourself from being caught off guard. And if you find that flame has dimmed, this is not failure. It is simply the moment to strike the match again, without shame, calmly, without drama, and return to the tower. Because the ships, the ones carrying your very supply toward you even now, somewhere still out past the edge of what you can see, are still out there in the dark, still watching for your light. I keep my flame steady long after the excitement of the first day has passed. The ninth key is this, and it is the gentlest of them all. Receive before it arrives. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that gratitude spoken in advance is the truest receipt the unseen substance recognizes. Not gratitude as a performance for anyone watching, but the quiet, private thank you of someone who has already, in her heart, taken delivery. And here is the first angle to see this from. Imagine a woman named Ruth, who each evening sets the table for 4, though on many nights only 3 chairs are filled. She is not confused about how many people live in her house. She simply refuses to forget that her home was built for abundance, not scarcity. And so the 4th plate sits quietly at the table, waiting, not as wishful thinking, but as a decision already made in her own mind, that more good is welcome here. Her neighbors might call it strange. Her own family teased her gently about it for years. But Ruth understood something the rest of them had not yet learned. That you do not wait for the guest to arrive before you set the table. You set the table so the guest has somewhere to sit when they do. And this is exactly what Florence Scovel Shinn meant when she spoke of receiving in advance. The table is set first, the thanks are spoken first, the room is made ready first, and only then does the good find its place already prepared for it. Now consider the second angle, the posture of the hands themselves. Because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that a clenched hand cannot receive anything new, no matter how loudly its owner insists she is open to abundance. Picture a man gripping tightly to the small amount he already has, counting it again and again, refusing to spend even a grateful thought on what might be coming. His fists are so busy guarding the little that he has no fingers left free to accept the more that is on its way. And compare him to a woman standing with her palms turned upward and loose, not clutching, not straining, simply ready. She is not richer than him on paper. Not yet. but her hands are already shaped for receiving, and Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the unseen substance moves toward the shape that is ready for it. So pause for a moment now, and notice your own hands. Are they closed around old fear, or open toward what is coming? And here is the third angle, the daily habit that trains open hands. Before you rise each morning, and again before you sleep each night, give thanks, quietly, specifically, for the very things your earlier decrees have already set in motion, not as a hopeful guess, but as a settled fact already received. This is the crown that finishes every key before it, the decree spoken, the check signed, the order placed, the self-concept rebuilt, the doubt corrected, the coat set down, the channel cleared, the flame kept steady, and now, at last, the open hand held out to actually receive what all of that faithful work has been quietly preparing all along. Receive before it arrives, and it arrives already welcomed. My hands are open now, and I receive freely all that my word has ordered. Here is the whole picture. It is not begging, it is decreeing. It is not a wish, it is a check already signed. It is not a hope, it is an order placed in faith and left with the kitchen. It is not your words alone, it is the self-concept standing behind them. It is not the doubt that ruins you, it is the doubt left uncorrected. It is not the coat that was ever really you, it is the light underneath it. It is not the grievance that punishes the other person, it is the grievance that clogs your own channel. It is not excitement that finishes the work. It is a steady flame, kept lit past the point of feeling like it. And it is not grasping that finally receives. It is open hands. And when you place all 9 of these side by side, you notice they were never 9 separate keys at all. They were 9 turns of one single key. The recognition that you have always been the one giving the orders, whether you knew it or not. And tonight you simply learnt to give them on purpose. And if you find, after tonight, that you want a steady hand walking beside you while these 9 keys settle into daily practice, that is exactly what the Overflow Covenant was built to be. A small monthly companion, gentle daily decrees, short teachings drawn straight from Florence Scovel Shinn's own principles, and a quiet community of others learning to give their orders on purpose instead of by accident. It is $37 a month, backed by a full 30-day refund. If it is not a steady help to you, you will find the link in the description below this video. There is no pressure in this invitation, only an open door. The same kind of open door this whole teaching has been describing all along. Say it once more with me. In closing, money is my faithful servant. It has been waiting all along for my spoken word. I give my orders now in perfect faith. My word is my wand. Money has been waiting all this time, patient, faithful, listening closely for your voice. And tonight, at last, you gave it something worth obeying.